Hi, I'm Liz Hamson, editor of Property Week, and I'm delighted today to be joined by Rob Thompson, partner at Dentons, for an in conversation with on the changing relationship between landlords and tenants. And boy, has it changed a lot recently. CVAs have been a big flashpoint between the two, with landlords routinely portrayed as the villain of the piece, while tenants get away with what sometimes looks like rank abuse of the mechanism. COVID has only strained relations to breaking point. Rob, you have clients on both sides of the landlord-tenant fence in the retail and hospitality sectors. How have they responded to the COVID challenge?
Well, as you know, Liz, the impact of COVID and the lockdown measures over the past 12 months has been profound, not just for retailers and those operating in the hospitality sector, but of course also for landlords. Many predict a surge in consumer demand in both the retail and the hospitality sectors as we come out of lockdown. But for many landlords, they will be licking their wounds for some time to come as a result of the sort of package of measures that they've had to endure and offer to their tenants during the pandemic. These have sort of ranged from shorter leases being taken, rent reductions, rent-free periods, rent deferrals, monthly rent payments, and all sorts of other rent-based arrangements to deal with sort of turnover and so on. In some instances, we've seen tenants willing to agree lease term extensions as compensation to soften the blow for landlords. But in some cases, we've seen arrears written off, but in some they haven't been. And of course, that's potentially storing up a very significant problem once the moratorium is lifted. As you say, we've also seen some pretty high-profile CVAs, notably the Travelodge CVA in the hospitality sector. That's their second in 10 years. And many landlords see these as rather cynical exploitation of the insolvency regime by investors in order to recapitalise their businesses at the expense of their landlords.
Do you see the relationship deteriorating as it has been for a long time? Do you think it is continuing to deteriorate, or have there been small signs of improvements? Are retailers starting to be a little bit more realistic about their expectations?
Well, I think they are being a little bit more realistic. I mean, in many sense, the irony of the COVID and pandemic situation is that it's actually forced and focused minds on both sides. And in many cases, they've been driven together by the economic impact of the pandemic, you could argue. But it will remain to be seen as I say, as to what will happen post the lifting of the regime once those government protections are taken away.
But retailers in particular are seen to have the upper hand still, aren't they?
Very much so. I think that's absolutely right. And I think that will be likely for some time. I mean, it'll be interesting to see what happens in relation to this period now going forward. I feel that those retailers that have engaged with their landlords and have sought to agree, re-gearing and the terms of their leases, I think they will be in a good place coming out of the moratorium. But of course, those that have buried their head in the sands, perhaps less so.
And there seem to be rather too many of that latter group, sadly. I mean, there's been a lot of talk, hasn't there, about the need for a switch to turnover-based rents, shorter leases, greater flexibility, and ultimately about the need for more of a partnership approach between landlords and tenants. What do you actually think needs to happen, and what needs to change to make that happen?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think turnover-based leases are not new, of course. They've been around for some time. And they're very good examples of where they've worked well, such as, the London Designer Outlet, for example. But overall, they only represent about 10% of the rent arrangements across the sectors. And landlords, as you know, have been very reluctant to abandon the traditional model of fixed rents and upwards only rent reviews. Many have been unwilling to really get under the skin of the sort of tenants operating businesses to really understand that side of things. They don't really want to grapple with things like, online sales and the knock-on impact of how that will affect their valuations, both historic in terms of looking at revenues and also looking forward. But I really feel that there's a systemic change in the traditional bricks and mortar retail sector, and that was well underway pre-COVID. and probably COVID has only really exacerbated the situation. The spate of retail failures, though, has made landlords sit up and take notice, and I do think more flexible lease terms are here to stay. But I don't think we're going to see a wholesale switch to turnover-based leases in the short term. But I do think we might see more leases with perhaps fixed base rents and turnover-based top-ups, as this will give greater security for landlords when they come to do their valuations.
And so when you say the 10%, are you talking about all of those, or are you saying that it's just the turnover-based, the hard turnover-based rents would make up about 10%?
Yeah, it's predominantly just the hard turnover-based arrangements. And I think, as I say, I think we may see a shift more towards the hybrid model. Some hybrid models are already in place, but I think, as we go forward, that we'd like to see more of that.
So what, can you put a percentage on that? Where do you think we're going to go to? If we're starting from a base of around 10% now, where are we going to end up?
I think you could easily see that sort of in the next 3 to 5 years rising to something like 25%, perhaps north of that. And I do think the sort of key element of that is really probably going to be around, can lenders in particular get themselves comfortable with the sort of new valuation methodology, and of course you'll have a sort of slightly two-tier system where you've got existing leases perhaps on one basis and perhaps more flexible lease arrangements on the other. It will need time for some of those older leases to sort of work through.
And you talk about length of leases as well, obviously coming down quite sharply. What length are we going to end up at?
Well, I think, on the continent, of course, you have much shorter leases already, but I mean, the day of the sort of the long institutional lease has probably had its day, and I would have thought that it will be different from property to property, of course, and it will depend on things like, the investment that's been made in the original development by both landlord and tenant at the outset. But you could see those lease terms coming down to sort of, perhaps 5 years or less, even in some locations.
That's extraordinary, isn't it, when you think about the old 25-year lease? So they're completely gone, aren't they now, really? What about the landlords here? I mean, how are they going to fare? I mean, people sometimes forget that many pension funds have their money invested in the big landlords, and yet they've been cast as the villains of the piece. What impact has the moratorium on evictions had on them?
Yeah, there's no doubt that they have had an impact, and it's led to a sort of very one-sided playing field, as you were alluding to earlier on, with the tenants very much having the upper hand, and it's led to sort of many retailers considering the moratorium as almost a sort of free pass not to pay rent, and some of those businesses have arguably got stronger during the course of the pandemic. And some have said that government measures should have been perhaps a little bit more targeted, as they have been in other locations. But on top of that, we've also seen, of course, the CVAs, which have strained many landlord and tenant relationships. And you're quite right that the impact that isn't spoken about so often is the impact on the pension funds and the individual investors, of course, that underpin those, and the adverse impact that's had on those investments, as well as, of course, as lenders too. So I do think it'll be interesting to see how that unfolds. There's a huge amount of sort of unpaid rent sitting in the system as the end of lockdown looms, and it's pretty unclear as to what will happen next.
It's also unclear as to what's going to happen with the moratorium, isn't it? Because we thought that maybe in the budget there was going to be an extension announced and it had been trailed, but that didn't seem to happen. What if we do get an extension? What impact is that likely to have?
Well, I think, as I say, I think a lot of the rent liabilities, I did say earlier on, some of course have been written off, some of those arrears, but some are continuing to sort of roll up. And you're just in a way kicking the can down the road with extension measures. My own view is that we need to be sort of looking to go back towards a sort of free market as soon as possible. And now we've got the government sort of lockdown or the indication on the timetable of lockdown measures being released. It is easier now to sort of see over the coming months, hopefully, a return to some semblance of normality.
Finally. And what about the budget? Was there anything else in the budget that was that leapt out at you as being potentially significant for the landlord-tenant relationship?
I don't think so. I mean, not immediately. I think one of the things that we were probably half expecting that may come next week, is this potential extension to the moratorium. We were all sort of eagerly viewing that when it came out. That didn't come. In previous extensions, it's often sort of come around the mid-month point in the relevant month, the extended month. So, let's wait and see what perhaps happens next week.
And what do you think will now happen to the relationship between landlords and tenants? So looking a little bit further ahead, I guess, post-pandemic, which hopefully is rather sooner than later now.
Yeah, I mean, I think hopefully the market will be allowed to sort of self-regulate itself. As I mentioned before, I think there are structural issues in the retail sector. They've been prevalent for some time. And in many cases, landlords, of course, won't really benefit from taking premises back because re-letting them will be very difficult in many situations. So in one sense, I think landlords will be forced to take a fairly pragmatic approach. And as I say, we've now got our timetable for sort of coming out of the pandemic. So, hopefully people will start to feel a little bit more confident on both sides.
Although it looks as though it's going to be a very different looking high street that we're going to emerge to, doesn't it? So with retail values decimated by the double whammy of fundamental sector problems and COVID, what does this all mean from an investor point of view? Do they see retail as a bargain basement buying opportunity or akin to trying to catch a falling knife?
Yeah, I think there's retail and there's retail, Liz. I mean, if you take one sort of element of the sector, supermarkets, they've of course continued to trade really well during lockdown. Those that are in well-let locations, so in well-let outlets in good locations, then they'll continue to attract interest, especially from sort of long-income investors. And that part of the retail market, I think, continues to look resilient. We all sort of continue to do our grocery online shopping, and more of us are doing it, but it only represents about 10% of the food shopping market. So there's a long way to go before these our own physical locations are going to be a thing of the past. I think the other aspect that's been quite interesting and held up very well is the kind of convenience retail market, and there's been a lot of activity, investor interest in that part of the market over the lockdown period. More broadly than that, though, I think many of our retail investor clients continue to watch the space pretty closely. Many are sort of pretty wary of committing capital to the sector, as they'll want to see how sort of consumer behaviour is likely to change post the lockdown being lifted, and consequently how that will impact on the retailers themselves. The smart investors in this sector are those that I think are willing to look through the retailer's lens a bit more and really get to grips with the businesses that are likely to trade well in the new world. So this will mean, I think, looking very differently at how they might structure their leases, as I mentioned earlier.
And when you say sort of looking through the retailer lens, what are we going to see then? What's going to be change?
I think an increasing move towards that partnership that I was talking about. I think the traditional marketplace for the high street retailer with large chains and so on is probably going to be a thing of the past. I think we're looking at increased investment in town centre locations. We need to try and bring people back to the inner core of some of these places, and that's probably a combination of being residential led, probably leisure led, and also working environments that perhaps change. In and around that, of course, there'll be different forms of retail, perhaps a more bespoke individual type approach.
It's interesting you say leisure-led, resi-led. It's kind of more of a community feel, isn't it, that people are talking about coming back to town centres and high streets. What about sort of the likes of Oxford Street and the sort of more mixed-use future that's envisaged there? What do you make of that?
I think that's sort of bang on with really the sort of things that we've been talking about. I think that we've all got our sort of perceptions of how Oxford Street has looked in the past. I do see that changing quite significantly. The large department stores, and how those are used, and perhaps there's opportunity to sort of repurpose some of those in relation to having some retail, but also combining that with sort of perhaps food and beverage and no doubt offices and residential communities all in and around that, a bit like you see very typically on the continent.
Well, that's an interesting point that you make there. Are there any particular cities that spring to mind that perhaps London could look to for inspiration?
Yeah, I mean, I think you look at places like Amsterdam and so on, where there is a lot of retail, smaller retail in and around some of the sort of clusters of residential accommodation. And it's a smaller city, of course, but you could see how a more sort of villagey feel can be created in some of our town centres and cities.
It does seem quite a Herculean task, though, for Oxford Street in particular, because it was so retail focused. What do you think the sort of immediate challenges will be to start moving towards this more mixed use community stroke village future?
Yeah, I think we probably need. I mean, it's obviously going to be very capital intensive. I see there's going to be quite a lot of private investor capital required. Obviously, you could see that perhaps not necessarily in London, but perhaps in other parts of the countries. More government grant type intervention. We've seen that in the past work very effectively. I think the planning system clearly needs to be in support of that, and it needs to be perhaps a bit more dynamic and responsive to the way that some of these stores and so on need to operate in the future, and the working environment in and around that. We've already seen that, of course, as a result of sort of the pandemic in terms of people's working practices and so on. As I say, I think we need to encourage more residential-led schemes, because I think that brings back the vibrancy if you can attract people to live in your inner town centres and cities.
Rob, would you live on Oxford Street?
I live on Oxford Street?
Yeah.
I probably wouldn't live right above the shop, so to speak. But you can see the appeal of living in and around the centre of Oxford Street. I mean, some very nice locations, aren't there? Just to the north, just to the south of Oxford Street. So I think it's even those that are just perhaps a street back. I mean, there's some very very attractive locations. So I could see that, particularly for a more sort of perhaps dynamic, young, youthful worker mentality, and living in top of the city, I think is quite appealing to some.
Well, it might do something to counter the sort of lights out London part of the residential offer in London as well, where it's sort of really well-heeled overseas investors that seem to own but not necessarily live in those homes. So if you had people actually moving in and above shops, younger people, it could be quite revolutionary, couldn't it, for Oxford Street? You mentioned what I think will be a critical part to the mix, and that's government support and intervention. What specifically on the tax front would you like to see introduced and could unlock some of this transformation that you're talking about?
I think they need to look at some of the sort of the relief measures. I mean, obviously we've got the current measures in front of us, but they aren't really sustainable. And although there'll be a runoff of some of those in the sort of coming weeks and months, I think we need to look very hard again at business rates, and perhaps have a more regular and targeted review of rateable values. And I suspect they'll also want to look fairly closely at the sort of taxation of online sales, and perhaps even offshore holding structures, to try and ensure that the retail playing field is a level one.
And have you been surprised that there's not been more on that online front?
Yeah, I think there is general surprise around that, but I do think it's something that probably in due course will get tackled, and I would expect something along those lines in the not too distant future.
And if there was one sort of single piece of government intervention you'd like to see, what would it be?
I think planning is key. I think just expediting that process, and there's certainly been attempts to move things along in that area. But I think that's the one area where I think we really need to be very proactive as an industry, actually, to try and unlock in a very sort of dynamic and quick way, because we're talking about fairly systemic issues that have been sort of that way for a long time, and we need to breathe some life and energy back into our town centres and cities in certain places, and that I think the planning side will be absolutely key to that.
And do you see there being sort of more of a partnership approach, not just between landlords and tenants, but also between the public sector and private sector?
I do. I think there's a very natural synergy that kind of needs to come together there, because the capital that needs to be deployed to unlock some of the vision that I think I've talked about and many people are talking about in terms of our inner cities is key, and it links to transport and infrastructure, and you can't just do that with private investor capital only, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, I think the solution has to be a lot more holistic, doesn't it, looking ahead, but particularly in light of the acute challenges that COVID has presented. Let's look a little bit further ahead. With all these non-retail tenants coming in, where do you see the landlord relationship in, say, 5 years' time or even 10 years' time? Is it going to be in a better place or just a different place? Give us your best and worst case scenario and tell us what you think will actually happen.
Yeah. Well, I think the worst case scenario is that nothing changes, that we stick with the sort of the lease structures that we have, and we have a lack of investment in some of our urban centres. I think that really would be tragic. But the best case, I think, is that our traditional high street starts to look very different over that time horizon, I think, Liz, and I see more, town centre residential accommodation. I think I see fewer retail chains. I think I see more bespoke and better quality individual retail offerings alongside, more of a sort of leisure feel. So all in all, I think probably what I'm saying is a sort of better consumer experience, and very much a closer partnership between retail tenants and their landlords as far as the leases are concerned, but also creating just a better destination. I think if landlords start to create a better destination and feel more confident about their product, then they'll probably be less concerned about tenants coming and going, because they'll feel more confident about their reletability. I mean, just take for example, what Redevco have created down in Brighton, and I think that's a pretty good blueprint for other projects along those lines.
So it sounds like you're pretty optimistic about the medium term and long term. And what about the short term?
I think on the short term, the next few months will be very interesting, because it'll be interesting to see what landlords do with some of the accumulated debt that they've got in relation to unpaid rent. Whether they do start to look at taking enforcement action. Perhaps some of that will be taken out of their hands, because their lenders may say, well, you're in breach of banking covenants, so therefore they have to do something. But the question then is, if that action is taken, where does that take us and what comes next? And I think that's the challenge for the whole of the sector.
We live in interesting times, don't we? Thanks ever so much, Rob. That was a really fascinating insight into what you think is going to happen with the landlord-tenant relationship going forward.